Hi, welcome back to Gen Z Bible class. We're going to continue on in our story about Noah and the ark. And well, we left him last time. He got on the ark and the Lord shut the door and the rain started and the boat just sort of sailed away on really what had to be probably the most amazing trip anyone has ever gone on. When you think about everything that was going on then and how they were leaving this whole old world behind them and just sailing off into a whole new world. Just an amazing time in the history of mankind. So we're continuing on as we have Noah and his family all on the ark, and we're going to get some more details about, particularly today in the first half of Genesis chapter 8, which is what we're looking at, particularly what it was like on the ark during the time they were on the ark. So we'll start with verse 1. It says that God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and the livestock that were with him in the ark, and he sent a wind over the earth, and the waters receded. And now the springs of the deep and the floodgates of the heavens had been closed, and the rain had stopped falling from the sky. The water receded steadily from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the water had gone down. One of the interesting things, as you start right out here, it says that God remembered. I guess if you didn't quite picture what was going on here, you might think, what did God get so busy up in heaven that he forgot he left Noah down there, and all of a sudden he remembered? Oh no, I better do something about Noah. Well, of course not. God doesn't forget things. He is not a man like we are that forget stuff. But I think really what it means, in a better way to understand that word God remembered, is like when you say, I'm going to remember my friend's birthday, or I'm going to remember somebody's anniversary, you send them a note or something. It's not that you forgot about it and all of a sudden you remembered, although that tends to be the way it is with me and my special occasions. But it simply means that God took time to acknowledge Noah. And what does he do? And I think it's significant. He remembered Noah, who had been on this boat for 150 days. And what happens as he remembers him? Well, continuing on in verses 4 and 5, on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. The waters continued to recede until the 10th month, and on the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. So basically what happens was the ark comes to rest. And I think maybe this is how God remembered him. Okay, I think I'm going to make things a little easier for Noah and his family. And I'm trying to imagine, one of the things we're trying to do is, we don't have all the details, but just imagine what was going on then. And the only experience I've had when it comes to things like being in a boat and maybe having it come to rest is the best vacation I ever went on in my whole life was with some friends, and we rented a 40-foot sailboat and sailed all around the Chesapeake Bay. I mean, it was unbelievable. But one of the things I remember about that, we were on there for 5 days, is when you would step off the boat after being on there for a long time, like your brain was still in the boat, but your feet were on the solid ground. And it was a little unnerving, to that strange feeling like, I think I'm still on a boat, but I'm not anymore. And I'm thinking that's probably something like what Noah and his family experienced, because they'd been bobbing around the water, and who knows how big those waves were, for 150 days. And I'll tell you, I know after 5 days, I was getting my sea legs, that they must have just been so used to that. And then all of a sudden, it stops. And how maybe a little frightening to begin with, but then realizing that, wow, this thing is, maybe heading towards coming to an end now. because this is going to be a really big event in their lives. So the boat stops. Another interesting thing about those two verses, 4 and 5, is that they mention some more dates. And you'll recall last time we were talking about this date that was given for when they get on the boat. And it's kind of interesting talking about how Noah was aware of the Jewish calendar at that time, because this specific day is mentioned. And here's a couple of more dates. The 17th day of the 7th month. So if you do the math, from the 2:17, which is when Noah gets in the ark, to 7:17 is 5 months, which times 30 comes out to 150 days. So that's where you get your 150-day number there. So I think that's kind of interesting. But then it goes on and it mentions another event that's going to happen shortly thereafter, from 7:17, the 7th month, 17th day, to the 10th month and the 1st day, and that's when the mountains appear. So I don't know, maybe at that point Noah could look out the window and off in the distance see these mountains appearing, meaning that the water is heading in the right direction, which is down. So now it's another interesting thing. We talk about the Jewish calendar, and there really are some fascinating things about it, where history sort of repeats itself different times in the biblical account, different things that happen, and things that happen later on in history, that they sort of repeat themselves, and some of these days, particular days, become very significant in the mind of God and in His eternal calendar. And one of those is this 7th month, which ends up being in the Jewish calendar called the month of Tishri, which is the month that they celebrate the Jewish New Year. But some people have also calculated that it's very possible that this particular day in the Jewish calendar, when the ark comes to rest, is the day that the resurrection of Christ took place. When we get to heaven, I'm going to be so interested in pulling out the books and the archives, and whether they have videotapes or I don't know. Probably they don't do videotapes anymore. To be able to see how some of these things have repeated themselves, and how God has been in control of time and history. And there's some fascinating things in terms of prophecy we'll be getting into later, where these dates really come into play. So the other thing that it mentions here is that the ark comes to a rest in a certain place, the mountains of Ararat. Now, a lot of people think that the mountain came to rest on Ararat itself, because there is a mountain, I think it's in Turkey or Iran or someplace like that, and it's Mount Ararat, and a lot of people are climbing up and down that mountain looking for Noah's Ark. But if you read it, it doesn't say it landed on that mountain. It said the mountains of, and this is a whole region. So that kind of opens up a lot of other possibilities for where this ark could be. And speaking about that, I think this is another little thing to think about. But that there are people that, I know some people have claimed that they found the ark, and other people are speculating about it. The bottom line is, I haven't seen any photographs yet. So, until I do, I'm going to be a little skeptical about that. But here's an overall question. You could talk about the ark, or the Ark of Noah, or the Ark of the Covenant, and people spending all this time trying to find them. Is that really important? Is it really that important to find these things? Now, I guess I would be happy if they found Noah's Ark and could confirm that's what it was. But to me, it doesn't really shake my faith at all, the fact that they haven't found it. And here's an interesting principle. I would speculate, and the Bible seems to indicate this is true, that if they did find the ark and they knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this was Noah's Ark. Do you think everybody in the world would still believe it or believe in God? And the answer to that is clearly no. Because, I mean, there's so much evidence now to prove that there is a God just in the things he's made, and yet people deny that. I believe that, people that are going to deny God would, even if they saw Noah's Ark or even the cross on which Christ, was hung, that they still wouldn't believe it. Speaking of the cross, I think back in the Middle Ages, they were selling so many little pieces of the cross that they probably could have built a whole ark out of the wood that they were selling. Because again, it doesn't really matter if you find the cross or the Ark of the Covenant or, whatever you could think of, biblical object, because we believe these stories are true. And as I keep saying, I'm not looking at this as some fairy tale or cartoon. I'm looking at this as actual history. I don't really need to have the boat to believe that. Well, anyway, what happens next? After 40 days, there's that number 40 again. Remember, we were talking how that's kind of always an indication of a time of testing. So the ark comes to rest, and Noah waits 40 days. And what does he do? After 40 days, Noah opened the window that he had made in the ark and sent out a raven. And it kept flying back and forth until the water had dried up from the earth. So he opens a window, and again, we're not real clear on this whole window thing, because we know when it describes the ark that there were windows all around, which there would have to have been for ventilation and fresh air. So whatever window he happens to open at this point, we're not real sure, but he lets out this raven. And interesting thing about a raven is that it's basically, well, we know there were two types of animals. There were clean and unclean. And we know a raven would have come under the category of unclean. So there were probably only two ravens on the boat to begin with, because there was a pair of every kind. And Noah is willing to send this guy out to do a little exploring. And now the thing about a raven is they are scavengers. So they'll eat pretty much everything. And maybe Noah was reasoning that if there's maybe some dead animals or something out there, this raven will be able to make a living by eating all that stuff. But as it turns out, it simply says that it just kept flying back and forth. So we're actually a little unclear as to what was going on with this raven. But I can tell you one thing. I don't know, I always seem to be talking about birds. Well, the birds are kind of the star of the show here in this chapter anyway. That if you ever have watched a bunch of crows flying in a certain direction, and they do, and around our area here in central New York, we have these big flocks of crows that will gather in the winter, and then they decide they're all going to go to a certain place, and you see them flying one after the other. But the way they fly is like kind of, this one's going this way and this one's going this way, and some of them seem to be going in the wrong direction. By their nature, I get this picture that it says here that they were just flying back and forth with no particular direction. Whereas, you think about geese and how they fly in such an orderly fashion that helps them, because the goose in front kind of makes it easier for the one behind. All these different characteristics of birds and what we learned from them. But the bottom line is, he doesn't really find a place to rest. And whether Noah was, looking out and, he would be watching him, and he doesn't go very far away and maybe comes back and, rests a little bit on the ark. We don't really know. But the next thing that happens is he sends out another bird. Let's read about that. Then he sent out a dove to see if the water had receded from the surface of the ground. This is in verses 8 and 9. But the dove could find nowhere to perch, because there was water over all the surface of the earth. And so it returned to Noah in the ark. He reached out his hand and took the dove and brought it back to himself in the ark. So first try this dove. And, you know, a dove is so much different than a raven. First of all, a dove would be one of the clean animals, so we knew that there had to have been 7 pairs of dove on the ark. And we also know that doves have this amazing ability, you know, or sometimes we call them homing pigeons, same type of bird that they would use back in the war days, sometimes like World War I or the Civil War. They would take one of these homing pigeons and they would tie a note. If they needed to communicate to somebody, they'd tie a note to it and it would fly back to wherever it came from, and somehow they know how to do that. I mean, this is another amazing thing about God's creation. So I think this dove could have gone a little bit farther and found its way back to the boat, because remember, the boat was stationary at this point. But he goes out, he doesn't find anything, he does return. Noah waits 7 more days, and he sends him out again. And this next time he comes back with an olive branch, which must have been a very exciting thing. He sends him out again after 7 days, and he simply doesn't return. But just maybe a little detour here to think about some of these spiritual principles that are illustrated in these stories. And just this idea of a dove going out and trying to find a place to rest. There's a really beautiful verse in Matthew, and these are the words of Christ, that talk about this subject of rest. And Jesus said himself, "Come to me," in Matthew 11:28, "all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." So just like this little bird was going out and, you know, he just couldn't find a place to roost. So he comes back to the ark to find this place of rest. And in the same way, spiritually speaking, you know, you can go through difficult times in your life, and you can get tired and weary going through this world from time to time, but we can see Jesus as our place of rest. So that's just a little, you know, one of the things we want to do is to look for these images that illustrate spiritual principles in all of these stories and these things that were going on back then. But we'll continue on, and we're going to read verses 10 and 11. It says that he waited 7 more days and again sent out the dove from the ark. And when the dove returned to him in the evening, there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. Then Noah knew that the water had receded from the earth. He waited 7 more days and then sent the dove out again. But this time it did not return to him. And again, what an encouragement it must have been when this dove comes back with this little olive leaf in his beak. And of course, you know, doves are kind of represent peace, and the olive branch is also something that represents peace. You know, back in the days when back in the day of the hippie, where I don't know if I was a hippie or not, probably not, but we always used to draw these doves on side of our vans and posters and things like that, because the dove was a symbol of peace. You know, peace, brother. So it's significant, I guess, that this dove, this bird of peace, comes back with an olive branch, which is also a symbol of peace. And but how encouraging that must have been to Noah. The thing that we got to keep in mind is God puts him on this boat. And, you know, I've mentioned I've been on cruises before, and I know how long I'm going to be on the boat. Usually it's like 7 days or 12 days or whatever it is. And I start out in one place and I come back to the same place. But this boat trip was a whole lot different. God puts Noah on this boat. He has no idea where he's going. He doesn't know how long he's going to be on this boat. So any sign like this, you know, when the dove comes back with an olive branch, must have been such an encouragement to him, because he's just waiting for all of this to resolve and waiting to be able to enter this new world that God is bringing him to, but he has no idea how long it's going to take. So a real encouragement that must have been. Now I'm going to read just two more verses before we finish today, and those are verses 13 and 14. By the first day of the first month, Noah's 601st year, the water had dried up from the earth. Noah then removed the covering from the ark and saw that the surface of the ground was dry. By the 27th day of the second month, the earth was completely dry. So we have a few more dates mentioned here, and one of them happens to be Noah. It seems like it's Noah's birthday. Noah's birthday at 601 years old, and this is the first day of the first month. Now, again, if you go to the Jewish calendar, that would be the month of Nisan, and it's the same year that the Passover would occur later on in the history of Israel, the first day of the first month. So again, I'm just wondering if maybe on these particular days when these very special events happen on the ark, if they don't repeat themselves, later on in the history of Israel as being a very special and significant day. And really, I wouldn't be surprised at all, because this is God's character. He is a God of order and design and order. So it also says that he removed this covering. Now again, we're a little sketchy on exactly what that meant, but the fact that he was able to and willing to remove this covering is telling me that he knew that the worst was over and that they wouldn't be needed anymore. Put all this safety equipment away, because we've landed, we are sitting high and dry, and we're not going to go anywhere anymore. And so he's able to, take away whatever covering this was. And then to be able to eventually step out, what a great birthday present that was for him, to step out of the ark after 1 year and 10 days on this boat into this new world onto dry ground. And that's an image, as we kind of wind things up here, that's an image that we see in a few other places in Scripture. This idea of dry ground. Maybe you're thinking of what I'm thinking of right now when we use that term, dry ground. And that is, one example was when Israel had to cross the Red Sea, and God opens it up for them. The Egyptians were behind them, and the Red Sea was in front of them, and they were being sandwiched in with no place to escape. So God opens up the water. But the interesting thing, it doesn't say they just got through, in muddy slime. It says they walked through on dry ground, which means that was an absolute miracle that God did for them. And then later on, as they're ready to go into the land of Canaan, the promised land, God does something very similar as they cross the Jordan River. And he stops the river so that these, 1 million, 2 million people are able to walk through. And that was something that got the attention of the people in Canaan as well, having witnessed this, miracle that God did. But thinking about the ground that we have to stand on, and this is going to be our good verse, and it's another image that we can put in our minds when we think about what all of that means to us. And again, it's from Matthew, and it is some of the words of Christ. From Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 to 25. Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the torrents raged, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and yet it did not fall, because its foundation was on the rock. And this is another image of, a firm place to stand, just like probably both of those birds were looking for some place to roost and a safe place. They can only fly for so long, and then they need a place to rest, and God provided that place of rest for them. And what he's saying here in this verse is for those of us who look to him and who hear the things that he says and obey them, just like Noah obeyed God in building the ark, that he provides, that it's just like building a house on a rock. You know, again, I used to be a carpenter, and I used to have to make these foundations, and I tried to make them as strong as I could so that a house wouldn't go anywhere. And God has given us this foundation, this rock upon which to stand. And when we put our trust in Him, we come to this place of peace and rest. So this is where we're going to end today, and I think that's a pretty good place to end, thinking about all the times in which God protected Noah through all the different dangers that we don't even know about, and brought him to this same place of rest, that we can have that as well in Jesus Christ. Well, I hope this has been an encouragement to you, and I'm kind of excited about the next time, because there's going to be some more interesting things as we look at the second half of chapter 8 in Genesis, and we see what things were going on after Noah gets off the ark. So I want you to remember that I'm thinking of you guys and praying for you, and hope you do join us again next time on Gen Z Bible Class.